NTV Television Network presents. The Other Day, Current Era, 1988. Translation and voiceover by BMI Russian. Good evening and welcome to episode 28 of our show The Other Day, 1961 to 1991, Current Era. Events, people, and occurrences that defined a lifestyle. Things that you can't imagine us without, let alone comprehend. Another year, another episode, and today we'll be reviewing 1988. Gromyko's resignation, Little Vera, the Olympics in Seoul, 1,000 years since Rus went Christian, a fire in the Academy of Sciences library, the battle against bureaucrats, AIDS, the first beauty pageant, Laskovyi May, Nagorno-Karabakh, Nautilus Pompilius, with commentary by actress Tatiana Drubich and author Anatoly Strelyany. Central Committee member, Foreign Affairs Minister Raoul Leroy and other officials. The year kicked off with a high-profile movie premiere, which was Assa. Thanks to director Sergei Solovyov, the youth underground scene moved to the forefront of contemporary arts. The cultural centers where they screened the film were jam-packed. Assa was the first Soviet film since Jolly Fellows with a soundtrack that was worthy of a separate release. The caption crediting Boris Grebenshchikov for the score was barely noticeable. It also had songs by Bravo and Kino. A love triangle mixed with a detective story with alternate Soviet reality as the backdrop. I cried, but I knew for sure that I wouldn't want to be the first cosmonaut. I'm no idiot.
ВВС. Военно-воздушные силы. ВВС.
This had some fresh characters, with the fathers represented by a kingpin and the kids by an out-of-control musician. This was the pinnacle of perestroika-era romance in cinema. So Catherine II was pen pals with Voltaire for quite a bit. Take off your shirt. In the late 80s, the spotlight was owned not by physicists or even poets, but rather by historians and economists. The public wasn't aware of the works of Yuri Afanasyev, who was rector of the Moscow Historic Archival Institute. People were more interested in his interviews and newspaper articles, where the professor would harshly criticize Bolshevism and the party, and conduct an early analysis of Gorbachev's policies. For 20 years, Roy Medvedev had been publishing books about Stalin and his cronies outside of the USSR. Now excerpts were being published in Soviet periodicals. Mikhail Shatrov's plays The Brest Peace Treaty and Onward, Onward, Onward were also considered to be historically accurate sources of information. Economists became the center of attention after an article in Novy Mir by Nikolai Shmelyov titled Advance Payments and Debt. It began with the sentence, "Everyone sees the state of our economy as unsatisfactory," which set the tone for business journalism. The genre was represented by such respected scholars as Abel Aganbegyan, Nikolai Petrikov, Stanislav Shatalin, as well as college professors Pavel Bunich, Gavriel Popov, Ruslan Kazbulatov. On February 20th, 1988, the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomy's Council of People's Deputies validates the results of a mass population survey and appeals to the Supreme Soviets of the USSR, Azerbaijan, and Armenia, requesting permission for Nagorno-Karabakh to become part of Armenia. By that time, the population of this province, that was officially part of Azerbaijan, consisted of 78% Armenians. On the 21st, meetings were staged in Yerevan in support of Karabakh, attended by up to 1 million people. On the 22nd, a conflict occurs in Ascaron with dozens injured and 2 Azerbaijanis killed. On the night of the 27th to the 28th, a massacre takes place in Sumkayit. Before troops were dispatched to the city, the official death toll was 26 Armenians and 6 Azerbaijanis. In both republics, new Central Committee secretaries were appointed. Someone suggested Moscow take direct control over Karabakh, but Gorbachev declared it impossible to change the autonomy's territorial status. This building is where the Council of Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Province in Azerbaijan used to preside, in Stepanakert. On February 20th, 1988, one decision made by the Council undid 70 years of Soviet national policy, theories on the Soviet people being a new type of community, and dreams about humankind being one, devoid of national identity. Turned out that national issues did exist in the USSR, and in fact they always had and would continue to, with the Soviet government being unable to find any sort of new solutions. Karabakh followed the official course, but they still wound up facing the usual interethnic conflict, where either side had its own interests in mind. Of course, both of them were right and wrong in their own way, but that's exactly what made them totally unyielding. After years of being swept under the rug, this age-old conflict got out of hand. Without asking Moscow for permission, Armenia's Supreme Soviet accepted the plea from Karabakh's local council. The same plea was naturally rejected by Azerbaijan's Supreme Soviet. For the first time, they ran reports in the news about illegal armed groups. Both sides employed locals who served in the Soviet army, which is also where they sourced weaponry. Around 300,000 Armenians from Azerbaijan and about 120,000 Azerbaijanis residing in Armenia were now seeking refuge. The Karabakh conflict was one of those ancient wars waged not for land, but for freedom and opportunity, and waged because one was Armenian, which speaks for itself, the other from Azerbaijan, which wouldn't be self-sufficient without adding that by extension he was a Turk. Gorbachev's pointless discussions with Armenian activists revealed that the center didn't fully understand this clash of nations and religions. Neither did the general public, given that their main experience with interethnic cooperation was during compulsory army service. Those who served were aware that Armenians and Azerbaijanis exist, but to them they were all dark-skinned folks from the Caucasus. Nobody really knew who started the conflict, which side was Muslim, which was Christian. We ourselves had yet to be informed that we were Orthodox Christians at the upcoming celebrations of 1,000 years since Christianization. More massacres were to come later that year in Baku, which led to dispatching even more troops. Moscow formed a special committee to run Nagorno-Karabakh and appointed Arkady Volsky as its chairman. But the situation was already out of control. Armed conflict escalated into the first ever local war waged on Soviet territory. Are prepared to get back to their normal lives, share their bread. That said, there are certain influential forces at play working to destabilize the situation. Throughout the night from the 14th to the 15th of February 1988, the country's primary academic book storage facility was up in flames, the Academy of Sciences library in Leningrad. Around 300,000 books and 20,000 newspaper binders perished. This was easily the most horrific fire to ever hit a Russian library. The fire started in the newspaper repository, where the fire alarm had been temporarily disabled 5 years prior. It wasn't until 2.5 hours later that the fire department was notified. Then they spent another hour looking for the keys and figuring out what exactly is on fire, until finally the doors were broken and books were doused with ordinary foam. The pile of ashes and charred book covers outside was 3 stories high. Librarians and volunteers were desperately trying to save 3.5 million wet books from getting moldy. They're starting to grow mold. It wasn't too long ago when you couldn't really answer the question who was head of the Soviet government after Lenin. And even those who knew couldn't bring themselves to pronounce the last name Rykov. It was at that moment when renegades, double-crossers, and imperialist intelligence agents with half a century of experience were declared prominent activists of the Communist Party and the Soviet state. The 27th Congress decided to put together a Politburo board with a lengthy name, on further study of material associated with repressions that occurred and so on. It was also called the Rehabilitation Panel. It prepared cases that were later processed by the USSR Supreme Court Plenum. In 1988, one day before he would have turned 150 years since he was killed, Bukharin was vindicated. A party favorite, as defined by Lenin himself, and a Politburo member in the 1920s, Nikolai Bukharin, with his motto "Get rich" and his theory on kulaks becoming ingrained in socialism, had never been more relevant. As if an early 20th century novel came to life, it turned out that Bukharin's widow was still alive, and that she had his parting letter addressed to future generations of party members memorized. Zinoviev and Kamenev were exonerated, the Industrial Party and the worker opposition. We'd find out that Trotsky was chairman of the Revolution Military Council and the father of the Red Army, that he was taken out in Mexico City on Stalin's orders, and his killer was honored as a national hero. Nobody recognized who they were, though everybody had seen pictures with them. The head of the board, Alexander Yakovlev, kept repeating that history had to be fully restored. The entire college study course on Communist Party history went straight out the window. Nobody issued a special decree, but they also informally rehabilitated the main victim of political repression of the Brezhnev era, Khrushchev. Just like it could be said that Lenin and Zinoviev were friends, there were pictures of Gagarin approaching none other than Khrushchev at the airfield. While the hunters were loading their rifles, on March 13, 1988, exactly 3 years after Gorbachev became head of state, the first counteraction attempt was undertaken on the ideological front. Russia's primary official newspaper, called Soviet Russia, published a letter from a reader, a lengthy piece titled "I Cannot Renounce My Principles," with a discreet mention of the author Nina Andreeva. Representing the people who hadn't lived their lives in vain, this chemistry teacher from Leningrad protested to the effect of, "We won the war, restored the country, flew to space, but now our legacy was about to be tainted and trampled on." The article directly apologized to Stalin and called to punish editors-in-chief who were abusing their glasnost. Gorbachev was in Yugoslavia at the time, other outlets were forbidden to engage in debate with Soviet Russia, and only Moscow News ignored the order. This period would receive the name 3 weeks of stagnation. Upon returning, Gorbachev waited until all of his associates expressed their opinions on the piece, and then Pravda published a rebuttal prepared by Yakovlev, which labeled Andreeva's letter as a manifesto from forces opposing the perestroika. Stalin was officially renounced by the Communist Party. A rift develops, but Soviet Russia was allowed to continue being a conservative voice in media. The perestroika was rapidly progressing, yet party congresses were only held every 5 years. And to discuss the tasks at hand, they summoned an all-union party conference. The name had an exotic ring to it, with this being the 19th party conference, and the previous 18th being held as far back as February of 1941. I suggest we demystify the case of Mr. Yeltsin. Whatever Boris Nikolaevich wishes to say, we'll let him say it. And if any of us have something to say, we can take the stand. Mr. Yeltsin, please. The conference revealed 2 opposing sides, Yeltsin and Ligachev. Yeltsin, who was still relegated to Gosstroy duties, admitted that he made a few mistakes and insisted that he be acquitted. "To everybody gathered here, I am very disturbed by what happened. I ask that the conference overrule the plenum's decision on the matter in question and restore my good name in the eyes of my fellow communists." We now give the floor to Mr. Ligachev, Yegor Kuzmich, Politburo member and Central Committee Secretary. Ligachev, who felt that he had the upper hand, refused to rehabilitate Yeltsin. The man did have a few reasonable propositions. But overall, Boris, your speech is an indication that you've come to some inappropriate conclusions. Ligachev's backhanded "Boris, you are wrong" was removed from the recording, and in the official record it was replaced with "Boris Nikolaevich, you are mistaken." Common folk on the streets responded by wearing badges saying "Boris, you are right" and "Boris, hang in there." As for Ligachev, his first and middle names Yegor Kuzmich were used to form a parable that alluded to his crookedness, to cast doubt over whether the Communist Party is on the right path. I'm sorry, but at this point it's not just tactics where we disagree, but also strategy. The highest-grossing film of 1988 was Little Vera. 27-year-old director Vasily Pichun presented an overview of urban lifestyle. People were eager to see the first Soviet film containing that sort of erotic scene. Out of the 55 million that saw the film during its first year in theaters, only the most outraged wrote letters to newspapers. They'd say something like, "I was too ashamed to tell my husband that I went to see this movie." For elder folk there was too much sex, but for youngsters there wasn't enough of it. Did I tell you that we're gonna have a baby? The Soviet Union's first soldier of the sexual revolution, Natalia Negora, even did a photo shoot for Playboy magazine. It's me. And here I am. A mix of sex and foreign flavor made into a box office frontrunner one final Soviet hit movie, Intergirl by Pyotr Todorovsky, a drama about a prostitute who left the country in search of happiness. You owe everything you have to me. I was the one who set you up. You remember who you used to be? A whore. One new name popped up after another: American syndrome, behavior disease, killer virus, the 20th century plague. AIDS was no longer treated like a disease that spread only in the West, and solely among drug addicts, homosexuals, and prostitutes. 30 citizens of the USSR had also gotten infected, and in 1988 it claimed its first victim, a 29-year-old woman from Leningrad. The Supreme Soviet issued an order on measures for preventing the spread of HIV. They conducted mandatory AIDS testing for donors and risk groups, which also included foreigners and those who recently visited foreign countries. Anonymous diagnostic cabinets were set up. Soon there was a scandal in Elliston, where someone with AIDS went through the Republican hospital, and 27 infants and 5 adults were infected through a dirty needle. At this point, the people were terrified to undergo medical procedures. People were allowed to bring their own syringes to get a shot, since there was a shortage of disposable ones. You could even bring your own scalpel to an operation. Manicures were banned at beauty salons where you could easily get cut, and it was hard to make sure that they're using sterile instruments. For the first time in Soviet history, there was a massive propaganda campaign. They printed booklets, pamphlets, leaflets saying that AIDS is lurking, among other printed material that they'd drop into mailboxes. Posters would explicitly indicate that this was a sexually transmitted disease, clear enough for a first grader to read. The topic of AIDS sparked active discussion of homosexuality, which was no longer taboo. One of the most popular jokes of 1988 went, "If a man is tender with a man, AIDS is a certainty." A bunch of formerly neutral terms now became ambiguous: active, passive, dual barrel, and even just the word boy. The color blue lost all credibility. The world of fashion and ballet became suspect. Newspapers eagerly revealed the truth about great domestic and foreign cultural figures, under the guise of who else is one of them. There was even some speculation about someone putting together a Russian man-love party, something to the effect of gay Slavs in honor of Tchaikovsky. In 1988, they held the first ever beauty pageant in Moscow. 2,500 contenders were weeded out in 4 stages. The finals were aired on television, tickets were sold out a month in advance. The title of Moscow's most beautiful woman was awarded to the youngest contender, 17-year-old Masha Kalinina, 5'9" in height, 24-inch waist, 35-inch chest. How is it that the Miss Universe contest is underway without our beauty?
I could give you a cop-out answer and say that they're just afraid of competition.
It was the Komsomol that arranged the contest. Aside from strolling the catwalk in evening gowns and swimming suits, ladies were asked questions to determine their level of intelligence. Finalists signed a contract with Buran magazine. The winner, a specialized school graduate who had a Spanish exam the next morning after the contest. Masha wasn't particularly pleased with her new title. Miss Moscow received hate from people on the streets and over the phone. The Foreign Language Institute turned down her application, and she had to pass on any international contests due to the hassle of attaining an exit visa. TV and newspaper editorial boards received a ton of collective letters on behalf of working women and mothers who were demanding to stop these humiliating displays.
Before beauty pageants, young Soviet girls and women only had contests revolving around their trade. It didn't matter who you were, but instead how good you were at your job. The pinnacle of these was a game show called Come On Ladies, where one's physical appearance was a factor, but where you still had to display your aptitude and take a quiz. Looking at legs, hips, and chests was officially frowned upon, seen as a sort of bourgeois attitude towards women as if they were horses. For the first time in socialism's later years, it used to be that a woman was first a Komsomol member, college student, athlete, and then a pretty face, but now she could make do with just the latter. A beauty queen could have now very well had uninformed political views and a shaky moral compass.
One core national issue was revealing itself after another, and in 1988, the Crimean Tatars began protesting in the name of their future. In 1944, they were accused of treason and sent to the country's eastern periphery. The former Crimean Republic was made into a province, and in 1954, it was transferred from Russian to Ukrainian jurisdiction. For years, Crimean Tatars weren't allowed to even visit their paternal home, let alone resettle. The Crimean Tatars held meetings in Samarkand and Tashkent, pickets in Simferopol, Bakhchisarai, and the Sverdlov Square in Moscow. And though the government board on the Crimean Tatar issue found no grounds for restoring the republic, by 1989, 38,500 Crimean Tatars had already moved into the region. The Supreme Soviet adopted a declaration on unlawful repressions against peoples. Land disputes in the Crimea led to skirmishes, and a new board ruled that the republic had to be restored. By 1990, over 80,000 people made it back to their native soil. In 1988, Soviet athletes reached exceptional heights in team sports, all while representing the USSR for the last time. First at the European Soccer Championship in Germany, and then at the Summer Olympics in Seoul. This was the second time the Soviet men's basketball team ever won Olympic gold medals. The team led by coach Alexander Gomelsky and starring Kortinaitis, Pomichus, Marchilionis, Volkov and Sabonis beat both the Americans and longtime rival Yugoslavia. Well, after we beat the Americans, we felt that, how do I put this, that we need to maintain that level. Very few believed that our women's volleyball team under Nikolai Karpal stood a chance. But the final match between the Soviet and Peruvian teams would be remembered as the emotional peak of those Olympics. The Peruvians were ahead during the deciding set, Karpal called a timeout, and after that our players did the impossible. After 32 years had passed since the last win, the Soviet national soccer team finally makes it to first place in the Olympics. Later that year, they won the European Championship, and everybody was expecting for similar triumphs to come in subsequent years. However, the spectacular achievements of 1988 would remain unsurpassed. In 1988, the hottest news topics were associated with extortionists, with hot irons being mentioned in every other criminal report. Racketeering quickly became a commonly used word. Early stories focused on things like a Moscow cafe being burned down or a gunfight on Bolshaya Brannaya Street. A mere 2 years prior, the great Soviet Encyclopedic Dictionary described racketeering as a form of gang activity in the States. But now they were admitting that former Soviet athletes, militia and servicemen were resorting to actions inherent to bourgeois mafia types. The first cooperatives offering security to cooperatives appear, and now every office was running some sort of security operation. The criminal code was amended, and the MVD put together special units to combat organized crime. By next year, there would be 51 of those active in the country. 1,000 years prior, in 988 AD, Grand Prince of Kiev Vladimir made the momentous decision of converting his subjects to the Christian faith. Soviet intellectuals, who for the most part cared little about religion, only remembered the event when they needed to justify people consuming too much alcohol. They did say that Vladimir turned away from Islam because it didn't allow drinking, while festivities in Rus revolved around food and drink. Meanwhile, the ideological masterminds were seriously concerned with them actively training atheist lectors. Religion had no place under socialism, but the church was trying to exploit this event to its benefit. To everyone's amazement, right before the anniversary, Gorbachev met with Patriarch Pimen and other hierarchs of the church. And immediately after, they approved the celebration's official status, all while lifting all restrictions as to what the press was allowed to cover. It wasn't too long before that they'd try to show domes on TV in such a way as to hide the crosses, but now political commentators were saying how much they enjoyed addressing priests as Reverend Father. Not long ago, a priest would at best be part of a peace protection committee, but now the clergy were an essential part of the upper crust. A year before the anniversary, a meeting with the intellectuals was reviewed on TV, where a certain author/historian claimed that we were all children of Christian culture. Alexander Yakovlev, who was also present, agreed with the idea, and so it was time to forget about proletarian culture. This kind of opportunity to make amends only comes around every 1,000 years, and so leadership made it very clear that they would no longer continue to impose atheism. In 1960s and 1970s era Poland, everybody was supposedly a communist, or at least supported the atheistic powers that be, while also undeniably being religious. Our situation was different. A 70-year assault on religion almost completely destroyed the tradition. That said, the raging atheists hadn't been particularly active since the early 1960s, mostly keeping to themselves and not caring too much about school field trips to active monasteries or private icon collections. Though from time to time you would hear someone complain about this sort of flirting with God. Soviet society wasn't so much atheistic or materialistic as it was on its own wavelength. Instead of a religious cult, you had one of social consumerism. Soviet paganism with building cooperatives, ladas, carpets, stirlets, and wheat vodka. 1988 was the year of Russia's second Christianization. Celebrations were held in Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, and Vladimir. After the anniversary, the church began to slowly repossess its real estate. An anniversary church council adopts a new charter, while canonizing Dmitry Donskoy, Andrei Gromyko, and Maximus the Greek. For the first time in Soviet history, they released a sizable run of Bibles. They also printed 500,000 prayer books.
Anything that's not forbidden is allowed. That's what Gorbachev said referring to the economy, and people are berating him to this day, since most of the laws that gave birth to the first Russian gangsters were simply absent in the Soviet criminal code. And then Gorbachev decided to apply the same rule to religion, meaning you can follow anything that's not banned. Now this is something he's neither criticized nor praised for. The general understanding is that he has nothing to do with this, especially since, formally speaking, Christianity was never even banned. In any case, at a certain point, the most prominent of the Soviet poets and female singers realized that they can openly wear a cross with zero consequences. And that point was the 1000-year anniversary of Russia's Christianization, which, as everybody knew, just had to be celebrated. However, celebrating the anniversary and continuing to complain about religion messing with people's heads would have been unbecoming, especially after it was declared that we should strive for pluralism. And that is how Christianity became a part of public life for a select few. Not through the usual back door like in the Brezhnev years, but through the main entrance it came. And that is how the faith of those in need, who were looking for the strength to carry on, was again destined to become an attraction for the overlords. Open your eyes, stupid! Voznesensky believes in Christ, so does Mikhalkov. Pugachev is wearing a cross. Even Pravda newspaper has seen the light.
For 30 years, Xerox had been the USSR's only supplier of copying machines. People kept saying that under Glasnost, when any information was readily available, it was time to let private parties also make use of such machinery. Authorities did not approve. Over the years, Xerox had become a household name in Russia, and instead of making a copy, folks would say make a Xerox. The Russian language adopted a couple of new colloquial verbs based on the word, including one that almost sounds like a swear. Under socialism, copying machines were objects of strategic value. In order to make even a single copy, you had to fill out an application and register the operation in a logbook, otherwise you wouldn't get the result you needed. Just like private tape players were unchecked movie theaters, copying machines that weren't owned by the state were basically unregulated print shops. By the late 1980s, they began to lift those restrictions, and Xerox machines became highly fashionable items, the mark of a new lifestyle together with foreign computers. The government begrudgingly admitted something about which the country's entire male population had millions of personal accounts. Turns out that hazing was a thing in the Soviet armed forces, or dedovshchina by word of mouth and in edgy newspaper articles, which is when veteran soldiers, or dedy, terrorize newcomers. Army and party leadership labeled the criticism as smearing of the armed forces. But newspaper articles weren't nearly as despised as a satirical novel by Vladimir Voinovich called The Life and Extraordinary Adventures of Private Ivan Chonkin. Before, you were supposed to laugh at Schweik and dislike only NATO's hawks. Private Chonkin, Ivan the Simpleton, was the only decent person in the army. 1 million copies of Yunost magazine in a country where they had compulsory army service made for an explosive effect, especially with the knucklehead commissioner being drawn to look a lot like Ligachev. In 1988, they withdrew the exemption from army service for college students. And draft dodging was now a feat of honor, courage, and heroism. In the zeitgeist, the army was no longer legendary and undefeatable, but instead tyrannical. Cheerful songs about 2 more winters and 2 more springs left were replaced by a different schedule, from plebe to veteran. And from then, it's 100 days until your discharge. The public was starting to seriously dislike all of the so-called power structures. In the army, you had hazing, militia suppressed protests. The KGB used to monitor dissidents and was now monitoring any and all free thinkers. Believe me, comrade, this will come to pass. The time has come for joy, freedom, openness, but the Committee for State Security will keep our names on the record. Today, the last fruit fly perished. The Baltic states, which had always been our Little West, were the first to establish national movements. They insisted that these were in support of the perestroika, though many speculated that their intention was to split away from the USSR. The earliest ones were Sayudis in Lithuania and the Popular Fronts of Estonia and Latvia. Sayudis came about due to discontent with the delegates that were elected by the All-Union Party Conference. The movement's first motto was quite restrained: glasnost, democracy and sovereignty. But then it would quickly begin radicalizing, and by the end of the year, Sayudis was in stark opposition to official Moscow. We're in the center of Vilnius, the main square where the main street begins, and its first building is where Sayudis set up its headquarters. Its inaugural congress was subsidized by the Lithuanian government. Sayudis quickly began to supersede the official government, with the latter barely showing any resistance. The pivotal moment came during celebrations of 49 years since signing the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, when Sayudis brought 250,000 people out onto this square. Prior to holding a congress, Sayudis ruled in favor of restoring national symbols and raising the tricolor Lithuanian flag over the Gediminas Tower. Sayudis' inaugural congress was declared open on the day when the Vilnius Cathedral was transferred to the Catholic Church. It housed a museum under the Soviet regime. And before proceedings on day 2, the delegates attended service at the cathedral. At the congress, Lithuania's new Central Committee Secretary Beriozka expressed his support for forming Sayudis. Kazimiera Prūskienė suggested the republic control its own finances, as in claim economic sovereignty. As for Sayudis' leader, who would also beyond a doubt lead the new Lithuania, instead of electing some liberal communist, as was the tradition in the Soviet Union, or even some politically biased intellectual, a social scientist, journalist, economist, or a lawyer as they do in Eastern Europe, they chose a conservatory professor, a man who was completely uncompromising and far-right-leaning named Vytautas Landsbergis. The rapid and radical changes had a simple explanation. Lithuania was the only Baltic country where the native population constituted the absolute majority. Attempts to organize a fifth column in Lithuania failed. Meanwhile, in Estonia and Latvia, national movements were immediately countered with international fronts, consisting of non-natives who were against the countries being independent. The Republican Communist Party in Estonia backed the People's Front, while in Latvia, leadership supported the internationalists. Bureaucrats were slowing down the perestroika, and therefore they were public enemy number 1. All-powerful bureaucrats were to blame for economic stagnation, for glasnost losing traction, even for a bad harvest. Apparently, there were 50% more managers in the country than people in the farming sector, at 18 million. And every boss had his own set of privileges. A new wave was picking away, washing and flushing out administrative bodies. Some ministries had up to a third of their staff laid off. The plan was to fire half of all public servants in Russia alone. The media ran reports on special apartment, catering, healthcare, transport, and country house arrangements. Turns out that some people had expensive granite and marble summer lodges, with swimming pools and saunas, with dedicated asphalt roads, power lines, and phone cables. The term nomenclature, formerly used internally by the party, became a pejorative used by liberal media outlets. In 1988, the battle against privilege resulted in them shutting down Beriozka shops that used to sell foreign goods in exchange for special checks to Soviet citizens that used to work abroad. The government had finally given in to the demands of commoners, who were not pleased with those people shopping abroad and then enjoying lavish lives back home as well. Now the playing field was leveled out. According to the official statement, such privileges made people corrupt, while devaluing the labor of those working back home in much harsher conditions, and all while hyping up trips to foreign nations. By the time they started shutting down Beriozkas, most of those who held checks were Soviet specialists who came back from developing countries, as well as officers of the 40th Army deployed in Afghanistan. They claimed that they earned the right to buy the best available goods, with them risking their health and even their lives. In their final months, Beriozkas were taken for everything they had. Everything was sold out, from expensive suits to cheap soap. Even after these battles were over, people were still holding on to worthless checks that hadn't been cashed in.
That's all the information we have today.
Laskovyi May was coming in. A multitude of identical boy bands begin their rise to fame, bearing cutesy names that would continue to resonate throughout the Russian pop music scene for years to come. But the most famous and commercially successful Soviet pop music band was also the most controversial. concerts were organized by local cooperatives, and the artists would usually lip-sync. The young manager Andrei Razin would explain that sports arenas didn't have the proper acoustics for a live performance. According to rumors, Razin introduced himself as Gorbachev's nephew and even his stepson. The media gleefully wrote that all of the band's members were brought up in orphanages. Their music was able to temporarily silence everything else. The band had a few singers who would perform songs about summer and white roses during its national tours, but only one of them was in the spotlight. Millions of photographs were sold in kiosks and in trains depicting the lead singer of Laskovyi May, whose name was Yuri Shatunov. Starring Tom Hanks.
I gotta pee. I believe he said he had to go pee.
In the fall of 1988, one of the Soviet Union's most successful public officials ends his career. 79-year-old Andrei Gromyko goes into retirement. He was the only man of his generation to leave politics with honor. This led to an event that had to have happened sooner or later, namely Gromyko being replaced as chairman of the Supreme Soviet Presidium by Gorbachev. Our people would be in favor of stability in particular. Gromyko used to be the Soviet ambassador in the US, the UK, and the UN. For almost 30 years, he was head of foreign affairs and was formal head of state for 3.5 years, which was a great send-off. The only other person able to go that route was Mikoyan, though he found his way to the top through the economic field. Gromyko stated that there was no way around his age, and that the perestroika was the only reasonable course of action. Simultaneously, Dolgik, Solomentsev, and Demichev were quietly sent into retirement. Lukyanov was appointed as Gorbachev's first deputy in the Supreme Soviet, and everything was pointing towards the government entering a new era. In 1988, the country witnessed two dramatic hostage situations, one of them during a flight from Irkutsk to Leningrad, the other when a school bus was seized full of kids who were being taken to Ordzhonikidze for a field trip. The Ovechkin family was on that flight, Ninel Sergeyevna and her 10 children. Her sons, the youngest being 9 and the oldest 26, were known back home as the Seven Simeons Jazz Band. They had their instruments with them, and also they smuggled aboard a few shotguns and a self-made bomb. 1 hour before the landing, the brothers drew their shotguns and demanded the plane set course for London. After a radio exchange with ground control, the crew said they needed to refuel. The Ovechkins ordered they fly to Finland, but the plane landed in Vyborg. Then the Ovechkins killed a flight attendant and demanded immediate takeoff. The plane was then stormed, and upon realizing that they had lost, 4 of the brothers took turns committing suicide, and one shot the mother by her own request before killing himself. 3 passengers were killed during the capture mission. Special services were much better at handling a situation where terrorists took 31 school kids and 1 teacher hostage on a bus in Ordzhonikidze. The demand to head for Minvodi airport was met, and there the terrorists were provided a plane, money, arms, and drugs in exchange for the kids. An Il-76 flight crew volunteered to become hostages, together with a lieutenant colonel of the KGB. The bandits demanded the plane fly to a country that had no diplomatic ties with the USSR. They ultimately landed in Israel, after they negotiated that the hijackers be extradited. So nobody was harmed, the hijackers were served their justice, and the plane made it back home. This had to be one of the USSR's most successful anti-terrorist operations. Moscow hosting Sotheby's for the first time, plus a Russian avant-garde exhibition held at the State Russian Museum in Leningrad, spelled the impending downfall of official Soviet art. At the auction in Moscow, foreign bidders spent over £2 million on 113 pictures by unrecognized artists. A particular favorite was Radchenko, whose works went for up to 300,000. After receiving acclaim in the West, contemporary underground and semi-underground avant-garde artists inadvertently received recognition back home, with Kabakov and Bruskin leading the charge. The Russian Museum held exhibitions dedicated to Pavel Filanov and Kazimir Malevich. Kandinsky's work was showcased in Moscow, and overall 20th century classic Russian art would be reinstated. The word Stalinism was a slanderous Western Sovietologist term that all Soviet citizens were now aware of. Gulag was one word from the title of a slanderous book by the renegade Solzhenitsyn, and something you could now vividly picture. Newspapers showcased a map of the country where a multitude of watchtowers indicated the location of Stalin's prison camps. One thing was being exposed after the next, while Moscow-based creative unions and liberal outlets were organizing awareness weeks, which drew thousands onto the Mel's House of Culture Square. This was the first large-scale exhibition on the subject of crimes committed by the current regime. They had a prison wheelbarrow for collecting donations to fund the building of a memorial. Speeches were given by the nation's most prominent people. One mass grave site was being discovered after another. People were starting to recognize Pol Pot's Kampuchea in their very own country. In May of 1988, they find huge common graves in the Kuropati rest zone near Minsk, where they buried the executed during the late 30s. The place was littered with human remains. Pictures from Kolyma depicted prison camps that had been inactive for 30 years, with intact fences, barracks, towers, all looking ready to be activated at any moment. Everyone, young and old, was exposing Stalinism. The super-popular kids' show Yeralash had its own cheeky and humorous take on the subject.
Canary can get the left side. That'll do, Sidorov. Now you get the right side. Just a bit more.
A kid builds a time machine in his own yard that allowed for summoning any historical figure.
Thank you, Comrade Stalin, for our happy childhood.
Correct, lad.
Well, thanks for at least not summoning Beria, you dumbass. Though the leaders of two superpowers agreed on the need for more active dialogue,
in 1988, Ronald Reagan finally saw the evil empire with his own eyes, during his first and only visit to the USSR. Later that year, Gorbachev flew to New York to meet with Reagan and his successor George Bush. This appeared to be a sort of transfer of ownership. Discussions about Star Wars and reduction of strategic arms were obscured by an active tour around Moscow for Reagan. He visited the Danilov Monastery, met with intellectuals, quoted Pasternak, gave a speech for MSU students. For the first time, they installed transparent teleprompters on either side of the stand, and so Reagan spoke while taking turns looking left or right. Reagan walked together with Gorbachev from the Kremlin out onto the Red Square. When surrounded by a crowd, it was as if the two leaders swapped roles. Gorbachev was answering questions in US election campaign fashion, while Reagan was almost Soviet in his stiffness. Later, he would try touring Moscow on his own. Near the Spaso House residence, he took a stroll down the Old Arbat, checking out souvenir prices and allowing street photographers to take pictures of him. Gorbachev flew into New York in 1988 to attend the UN General Assembly. Gorbachev on American soil. The Reagan-Bush-Gorbachev meeting took place on an unusually clear and sunny day on Governor's Island. After a chat, they posed for pictures with the Statue of Liberty close in the background.
And the Soviet leaders who were there were very much indicating that Mr. Gorbachev is going to move very heavily on the...
Perestroika frenzy, the blossoming of Soviet-US friendship. As the Chinese were brothers forever, like Hindi-Rusi Bhai-Bhai, Reagan appeared to be sending a signal to Gorbachev, as in you will continue on your path towards freedom with this guy. Meanwhile, Gorbachev seemed to be responding. The course is set, the goal is near, we'll get there soon.
For the Washington summit. You remember he wanted to show him the United States.
It was at that moment when Gorbachev got a call from Council of Ministers Chairman Ryzhkov, who informed him about a terrible earthquake in Armenia. Gorbachev had to cut his US visit short, while canceling his plans to go to Cuba and the UK to fly back to the USSR.
45 seconds that some people thought changed Mr. Gorbachev's image in the United States to some considerable extent.
On December 7, 1988, a subterranean wave shook almost half of the territory of Armenia. Spitak was subject to a quake with an intensity of nearly 10, while Leninakan and Kirovakan saw almost 9. 26,000 people perished in a matter of seconds. 700,000 were left homeless. In the evening on December 8th, a state commission led by Ryzhkov blew into Armenia. His long stint near the earthquake zone resulted in his popularity skyrocketing. Gorbachev only made it by the 10th. It was havoc on an unbelievable scale. Several rescue workers suffered heart attacks. 9-story buildings were turned into piles of debris, and some people were reduced to a wet imprint on a slab of concrete. We're in Spitak, the epicenter of the quake. The entire city was leveled. Almost 15 out of its 20,000 inhabitants were killed. What's now a factory used to be the local stadium, which is where they brought the corpses. There were so many being extracted from the ruins that they ran out of coffins. The earthquake affected 21 towns and 42 villages. Help would only arrive to the villages 6 days later. Everything was destroyed. There was no communication with the outside world. At the time, it felt as if the entire world was laid to waste. Moscow newspapers wrote that there was a silver lining, in that this was a national tragedy, and those tend to bring people together, and that given the circumstances, Armenia and Azerbaijan would put the Karabakh dispute to rest. From 1988 and on, the Armenian earthquake was regarded as more important than that which occurred in Tashkent. For the first 24 hours, they were unable to deploy a single crane, which is what you need the most when sorting through rubble. As it turned out, Soviet cranes didn't fit inside Soviet planes. Moreover, the USSR didn't have any departments for responding to natural disasters. Foreigners brought with them devices that were able to detect even the faintest signs of life underneath the rubble, and they were our main hope. During the first 10 days, 15,300 people were extracted. We're in the Swiss district of Spitak. The Italian one is nearby. There's also a Norwegian hospital and streets made by Czechs and Germans. The Armenian earthquake prompted us to accept international assistance for the first time ever. 2 years prior, we turned it down after the Chernobyl accident. This time, French rescuers made it to the scene before even ours did. The Brits and the Americans also acted fast. You had foreign military aircraft landing on Soviet airstrips for the first time since World War II. We simplified all of the formalities associated with visas. For the first time, we overcame our ever-present pride and xenophobia, as well as concern on behalf of authorities that our country might be infiltrated by foreign intelligence operatives posing as rescuers. For the first time, we admitted to having a situation which we were unable to handle on our own. The maiden flight of our very own reusable spacecraft was a response to the US Space Shuttle program, after a long 7-year delay. The first flight would turn out to be the last, effectively making the Buran a disposable spaceship. Buran spent 3.5 hours in space. It went around the Earth twice and landed at Baikonur on autopilot under stormy weather conditions. The craft being unmanned was seen as a detriment, though in reality a radio-controlled ship that's able to land unmanned and with no ECU on board is a serious accomplishment. This was something the American shuttle couldn't do. This one-off success of a reusable spacecraft required the efforts of 1,200 enterprises. It took 2 years just to clad the exterior with tiles. Out of 38,000 tiles, only 5 fell off during landing. After the flight, they admitted that work on the shuttle began back in 1976, that Korolev saw them as the future, and that back in 1967, Gagarin's diploma thesis was on reusable spacecraft. In 1988, it appeared as if the youth that gathered in vast numbers at stadiums and clubs had absolutely zero interest in English-style rock and roll. Also, it seemed as if the latter would never again become relevant. In 1988, Russian audiences and Russian rock were inseparable. Even Aquarium dabbled in current events. Here's a late Perestroika-era hit by Grebenshchikov based on Vertinsky's I Do Not Know Why and Who Needs It, which everyone thought was a song about the war in Afghanistan. This train is on fire, which everybody thought was about the Perestroika or even Gorbachev and Raisa. Kino, a band led by the ferocious Viktor Tsoi, coined the main slogan of the heyday of Russian rock. Nautilius Pompilius from Sverdlovsk attains tremendous success. The band's leader Vyacheslav Butusov, wearing a coat and breeches, sings songs written by Ilya Kormiltsev. They contain a political and economic analysis of socialism as if done by a serious magazine. The poor pray to us and their poverty is guaranteed. Forged, khaki-colored ball, peas seeds were constantly being showcased by Vzglyad. People abbreviated their convoluted name to just Now, and the lyric Alain Delon does not drink cologne grows into a parable. Other hits put out by the productive duo Butusov-Kormiltsev included the romantic Goodbye America Oh, as well as the sentimental I Want to Be With You. The haters suggested that they wanted too much to look like Kino. Yuri Shevchuk moved from Ufa to Leningrad at some point. His band DDT spat out homespun truth on behalf of Russian rock, which could also be ancestral, homegrown, or homebrewed. And that was 1988 in our show The Other Day, 1961 to 1991, Current Era. Events, people, and occurrences that defined a lifestyle. Next time we'll discuss 1989, war zones, the Memorial Society, the Satanic Verses, the First People's Deputy Congress, Faded Jeans, We Withdraw Troops from Afghanistan, Naval Cadets Charge, Demolishing the Berlin Wall, Eskrava Isaura, 600 Seconds, and Fifth Wheel. See you for a new episode and a new year. Farewell.